Welcome to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast for anyone who is super confused by that most recent medical study you heard about in the news. I am Matt Fox, professor of epidemiology and global health. I am here, as usual, with Don Thea and Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health.
Hey, Matt.
And we are, apparently they speak in unison, we are here in the Boston University Godly Studio. No jokes, Chris. And we are truly excited to have a couple of guests in the studio with us today, both of them from the Boston University School of Public Health Department of Biostatistics, one of whom is going to feature in segment one. That's Ludovic Trinquart. Did I say it right?
You did.
Close enough. And one who'll be featuring in segment two, that's Mike LaValley, so we'll bring him in later. Before we get started, we did want to take a second to remind you about the Population Health Exchange. That's Boston University's School of Public Health's resource hub for lifelong learning. Find out more at www.pophealthex.org, where you'll find this podcast as well as many other population health learning programs and tools. And as a reminder, go ahead and give us a rating on iTunes and any of your other favorite podcast.
Yelp.
Download Yelp. You want to give us a Yelp rating where we'll take that, whatever you want. The delivery was slow, whatever it is.
The jokes were lame.
In addition, Ludovic has an announcement to make about something really important.
So Mike LaValley and I are excited to launch a new course for the PHX Summer Institute.
Ooh.
We'll give a 3-day course on systematic reviews and a 2-day course about meta-analysis.
And so how do people sign up for that?
You can register on the Population Health Exchange website.
And is that a course that you pay for, or is that how does this work?
Yeah, you
make checks payable directly to you or to the university. All right, you'll find that all out on the website.
He's got a real FM voice, doesn't he?
He does.
Unlike us, we're all trebly.
He sounds smooth jazz.
Yeah,
really. All right, well, now we got to up our game.
I know.
So now let's get into the show. So today, in our first segment, which is our Journal Club segment, we are going to talk about a study that talks about the benefits of various antidepressant drugs for treatment of major depressive disorder. Then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive segment, we're going to talk about what are the pros and cons of meta-analysis and what you should be looking out for when you read them. And then in our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing segment, we will get into some of the things that have us snickering in the hallways. And we do want to let you know that we have now put Chris on a timer for his.
God only knows why. I'm the best part.
So we will try and keep him to a reasonable time frame.
Half an hour.
Half an hour at most, absolutely. So let's get into our first segment. Before we get into the specifics of this study, Ludovic, can I ask you to explain a little bit about yourself, and hopefully that lets people know why you're here?
Yes, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biostatistics. And most of my research has focused on evidence synthesis, meta-analysis, this novel form of meta-analysis called network meta-analysis that we're going to talk about, meta-analysis of observational studies as well.
Wow, we have a ringer.
Yeah, we have somebody who actually knows what they're talking about, which is
that's breaking the mold.
Yeah, it's a bit unusual, but we'll go with it. So, segment one, we're going to get into an article that looks at the effectiveness of various antidepressant drugs. And this is a study that you can imagine has gotten a lot of attention, appears to be a little bit controversial as well. And it came to us directly from Ludovic, so that's part of why he's here in addition to his expertise in the matter. Study was published in The Lancet. The first author was Andrea Cipriani of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, and it is entitled Comparative Efficacy and Acceptability of 21 Antidepressant Drugs for the Acute Treatment of Adults with Major Depressive Disorder, a Systematic Review and Network Meta-Analysis. So let me give you some of the headlines on this one. So Time Magazine says, these antidepressants are most effective. I don't really know what that one means. Antidepressants do work, and many more people should take them. Major international study says, that's from Newsweek. Most popular drugs prescribed for depression work, but they're not perfect, says Business Insider. And massive new study finds antidepressants work better than placebo. That's from Nova. So a lot of headlines, which I'm not sure actually sum up what the study was really all about.
That is a remarkable thing for Nova to say.
I should be clear.
To phrase it that way, that massive new study shows
Nova Next.
Well, still, but that massive new study, quote, massive,
yep,
shows that antidepressants are better than a sugar pill.
It's misleading, I would say.
I think this cuts into Chris's 30 minutes.
All right.
Okay. So in that, let's start with you, Don. Can you give us the overview with the study, with the full understanding that you are not an expert in network meta-analysis, and we're not going to embarrass you by asking you to explain what that is, but just give us
totally faking it here.
Yeah.
All right. Let me give you a little background. So, this is a massive study, and it addresses an issue that is really of great global importance, which is depression. It's, I think, one of the major non-communicable diseases that has been identified in the global health, global burden of disease studies.
Yeah.
And it comprises, I think, 20 some odd percent of the global burden of disease, affecting about 350 million people globally. That said, it is also an area that has been extensively researched in terms of the efficacy of these particular medications, with, I think, in one counting, there were over 1,000 randomized controlled trials that have been done to date on various antidepressives. And there's lots of RCTs, and there's lots of ways to compare them. The ones that have been done previously, that have been included in prior meta-analyses, were compared with a placebo or a head-to-head analysis. The placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trials are fairly self-explanatory. The head-to-head comparisons are where a new drug that is just being introduced is being compared to best alternative therapy, or therapy that has previously been proven to be efficacious. And now we're in a position where we've got lots and lots of these various medicines. And so what these authors tried to do was try to use this newfangled technique, which we're going to hear all about from Ludovic, that takes into consideration a lot of data that has been published on 21 antidepressive medications, and try to really make your way through what is really a thicket of different comparisons. So the goal for this was to compare and rank the antidepressants for unipolar major depressive illness. What the authors did a systematic review where they collected for these 21 antidepressants all of the published and as much of the unpublished literature as they could find. And I have to really give it to them for the effort that they went through to dig up all of the data that was not easily accessible through the normal means. So they went to clinicaltrials.gov and they screened that, and they collected all of those. They actually contacted the pharmaceutical companies and got trial information from them, and they included all of those. So it's a very comprehensive database. They excluded trials that were quasi-randomized, that were incomplete, or included more than 20% of the depressive subjects who had an associated bipolar disorder. Or studies that included psychotic depression, treatment-resistant depression, or serious comorbid conditions. So they tried to homogenize the population as much as possible. And they went through a systematic assessment of bias in the studies that were included in this meta-analysis. I don't know if we're going to get into that
maybe
in any detail. So the primary outcome was efficacy. Outcomes were efficacy, which was the response rate, and acceptability, which they defined as all-cause discontinuation. So they managed to collect 28,000 citations and winnowed that down to 522 trials with 117,000 participants. And they tested for, as I mentioned, 21 antidepressive medications and placebo. And the bottom line is that overall, antidepressives were found to be more effective than placebo, with an odds ratios ranging from 2.13 to 1.37. And they were generally acceptable, with all but 2 antidepressants associated with more dropouts than placebo. There were smaller differences between active drug were found with placebo-controlled trials versus head-to-head trials, whereas there was more variability in efficacy and acceptability in the head-to-head trials. So bottom line is they seem to work.
It seemed to work, and done across a large number of different studies in a lot of different contexts. But as you say, they tried to sort of in some way homogenize the population a little bit to at least be looking at the same condition. So, Ludovic, can I then start with you and ask you to give me your critique of this study? And in particular, can you address the question of, did we actually need this study given that there had been a previous meta-analysis done by the same group? I'm not sure how long ago.
Or maybe, Matt, what we should do is we should start with a description of network meta-analysis, since I failed in that or didn't even attempt to do that.
If you want to go with this in a logical way, you're welcome to do so. But I think that's not what we do.
That's unusual, huh?
Go for it.
So I'll start with an explanation.
Yeah.
So as you know, conventional RCTs compare two drugs, drug A versus B, and conventional meta-analyses synthesize the results of several RCTs. As you've described, we're in a situation where we have multiple treatments that are competing, and the question is no longer is drug A doing better than placebo. The question is among treatments A, B, C, D, E, which are the best, or which one is the best. Problem is we lack randomized controlled trials, and it's just a question of feasibility and cost. Here we have 21 antidepressant drugs. That makes 21 times 20 divided by 2, 210 comparisons. So you need at least 210 RCTs to inform each of the possible comparison between the drugs.
Or one giant trial in which we randomize people to 21 different arms.
21 arms.
I think we'd need more than 350 million depressed people. That's
fair enough.
So this is where this mathematical model comes handy. So it relies on two principles or two stages. The first one is using indirect information when you don't have an RCT comparing drug A to drug B, but you do have RCTs comparing A to placebo and B to placebo. You're going to use the transitivity principle. So if Matt is taller than Don and Don is taller than Chris, Matt is taller than Chris.
Simple, I like it.
Which I am.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Yeah.
So far, so good.
So we do that based on effect sizes. And so if the effect size of A versus placebo is better than the effect size of B versus placebo, we conclude mathematically that A is doing better than B. And if there's no bias in the component trials, it's mathematical, so it's unbiased. Mm-hmm. The second step is in a situation where you do have at least one RCT comparing A to B, then why would you use the indirect evidence and use trials versus placebo? So the reason why is to use all the information that is available and thus increase statistical power and precision, provided that the information given by the head-to-head trials is consistent with the information obtained by the indirect sources. So that's it. That's network meta-analysis, using indirect information and combining it with direct information provided by head-to-head trials.
And this is what allowed them to create this hierarchy of effect sizes from biggest to smallest.
You're right. There are two objectives when reporting the results of a network meta-analysis. The first one is to document all possible 2x2 comparisons between the drugs. So here we want effect sizes for the 210 comparisons between antidepressants. We also want something that is more easily approachable, and people aim for a hierarchy, a rank order of efficacy or safety between all those drugs.
And so, what's your take on this one? I mean, do you buy the conclusions?
So let me address your first question. And was it justified? Do we need additional network meta-analysis? So it's an update, as you mentioned, of their previous effort that was published in Lancet as well in 2009. And they've considerably expanded the amount of evidence that is covered by this systematic review. So in a sense, yes,
we do need it.
We do need it.
Okay.
The previous network meta-analysis covered 12 agents. Now they're covering 21. They've also provided an incredible effort to identify unpublished data. So they were able to identify unpublished information for more than half of the trials included in the synthesis.
Which just strikes me as unbelievable that they were able to get this much unpublished data into a meta-analysis.
Yes.
It's astounding.
It reflects the the overall quality of the effort. It also illustrates a very important point in my view, is that this reporting bias issue is not binary. It's not is it published or not. It's a time to event issue. When we finally get access to reports of trials, it becomes available through the Food and Drug Administration that makes available reviews. It becomes available through the pharmaceutical industry when researchers contact them. And so it means that the evidence base is evolving with time.
Yep.
Now, as you mentioned, the conclusion is that all antidepressant drugs are beneficial as compared to placebo. And the second conclusion is that when comparing the different drugs against each other, the effect sizes are relatively modest. So one may say that this conclusion is not new and that overall this network meta-analysis doesn't add much to what was known previously. And in particular, previous meta-analyses reached the same conclusion. A prominent meta-analysis in PLOS Medicine by Kirsch and colleague in 2008 showed about the same magnitude for the effect size. Eric Turner published a prominent article in the New England Journal of Medicine that already incorporated and published data and reached pretty similar effect sizes.
So overall, you would say that, would you say that the quality of the meta-analysis is good? The information that we obtained from it is impressive, but it's not particularly novel, not particularly new, given what we already knew.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Chris, how about you? What was your take when you read this?
Yeah, no, so it's a very, one has to imagine the amount of work that went into this is a bit humbling. Not just in finding the papers, but in ranking their quality, et cetera. I mean, it was a spectacular undertaking.
It's got a web appendix of like 250 pages.
Which I confess I did not read before
Really,
this session.
Chris?
Yeah, I figured that one of you would have.
Oh, fantastic.
So,
He's sandbagging on us.
Yeah. We'll get back to you, Don. Don't worry.
I want to steer this a little bit towards this companion editorial that was published in the British Medical Journal, which is a sort of an unusual thing that is like a sister journal will publish the editorial as opposed to the New England Journal. Was it Lancet? Excuse me.
Lancet published the paper. BMJ, you're saying, published an editorial.
And the editorial made some really important points, which I'll sort of click through. And the editorial was McCormick and Karownik. And it was published in 2018, just shortly after. And so the key points to note, one is that all of these studies focused specifically on patients with very severe depression. That is to say, a Hamilton depression score greater than 26. And the Hamilton scale, I looked it up yesterday, goes from 0 to 50. And anything, 7 or below is considered normal. So 26 is very, very impaired. So this is severe depression. And that's important because in clinical practice, antidepressants are used not just for patients with severe depression. They're used for patients with mild or moderate depression. And none of the data here give us any insight whatsoever into how antidepressants might function in patients who have mild or moderate depression. We just don't know. In fact, none of the clinical data really answers this question. So that's important to keep in mind. The second one is the duration. That generally these studies were pretty short. 8 weeks would be a typical length. And since we know that on average it takes 4 to 6 weeks before antidepressants really have much of an observable clinical effect, you can sort of see that an 8-week trial is not actually telling you very much that's useful, because by that time you've barely got through the run-in period before you're starting to see any clinical efficacy.
And their primary endpoint for this study was 8 weeks. Was at 8 weeks.
Was at 8 weeks.
It was improvement at 8 weeks.
So that's a very important distinction too, that sort of colors how we think about these data as they apply to clinical practice. Because typically when patients are started on like Prozac, they will be started on Prozac for mild to moderate depression, because that's very common. And they will be started on this med and they will take it for ever. They will not stop it at 8 weeks, which is really what these data are sort of suggesting, or the psychological associations are saying. They would take it indefinitely, even after the depression has resolved, as sort of like a hypothetical prophylaxis against the next bout of depression. And there is no evidence in this meta-analysis that tells us anything about whether these drugs can prevent depression or prevent relapse. We have no data.
Or really in any of the RCTs that have been done. They're all characterized by being very short in duration.
So we often talk about in this podcast, like, who is the study about and who are we applying the data to? And this is such a good example of how the meta-analysis tells us something very narrow that really does not in any way mimic clinical practice in the least. And so that is an important thing for the folks out there to notice.
Anything else you want to add?
On this one, I have so much to say about it, but I want to pass
All right,
off
so
to
let me
two of you.
give Don a chance to weigh in if you got any comments before I jump in.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned about from reading this study and from reading some of the other studies that were cited in this is that the placebo effect,
It's massive.
it has a
real.
profound effect in these particular studies, and that I didn't realize it, but that has been shown fairly conclusively that simply intervening with a pill, and presumably it is the intervention, it's the human contact, it's the structured follow-up that's associated with being involved in these studies that explains at least part of the effect, and that could in part explain why we found a relatively mild excess effect in the particular drugs that were being looked at.
Because depression is susceptible to the placebo effect.
Correct.
Is what you're saying?
Correct.
And it's also self-resolving in most cases.
And there was, what I'd like to do is I just want to read one quote from an article by one of our heroes, which is John Ioannidis.
Who is, by the way, is an author on this meta-analysis.
Right. And this paper was in Philosophy, Ethics, and Humanities in Medicine, Effectiveness of Antidepressants, an evidence myth constructed from 1,000 randomized trials, ? And he has one line, which I thought is great. It says, it's actually two lines. Perhaps most people given antidepressants for depressive symptoms would just need some attention from their physician and people to talk to and take some care of them. Antidepressants may be covering largely the lost placebo of human interaction and patient-physician interaction that has become so sparse in modern society.
So can I, that's a perfect place for me to jump in if you don't mind.
Nope.
On this placebo effect, because this is something that really fascinates me, which is, first of all, in the reporting of this meta-analysis, nowhere, even in the 250,000 odd page appendix,
All of which you read.
I read it cover to cover. I cannot find the probabilities of the events themselves. Am I missing anything? Did you all come across the actual cure rates in anywhere?
Did you read the meta appendix?
Oh, obviously.
Yeah, no, they only talk in relative terms. They don't talk in terms of the absolute effect.
I did come across a number which said that about 30 to 40% of patients improve in the placebo group. And one of the things that Ioannidis talks about, I think, or maybe I read it somewhere else, but is the idea that one of the criticisms that you could give to these trials is that you could theoretically manipulate these studies if you wanted to make your antidepressant look good by first having a run-in period where you gave people a placebo. A whole bunch of them would be cured, and then you're just left over with the group that is not susceptible to this placebo effect, and then your antidepressants would look really good.
And you exclude those that improved on placebo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't see that as a problem. Mm-hmm. I don't see why we wouldn't want to actually do that. If we think that the placebo effect is really, truly effective, why wouldn't we want to actually take advantage of that and save the antidepressants for people whom we think are really going to need it? To that effect, so then it starts to, so if you're saying, well, 30 to 40% of patients cure on their own or with the placebo, depending on how you would define it, all of these effects are, which we said were sort of modest, are defined in terms of odds ratios. If the baseline probability is 30 to 40%, then an odds ratio is going to overestimate the relative effect, such that these mild-sized relative effects are actually even probably inflated. Would you all agree with that statement? Is that
Absolutely. In fact, the BMJ editorial tries to take on that very issue. And they say, like, when you sort of break down the odds ratio and you look at the absolute effect sizes, that about 40, let's say that for I'm assuming you had 10 patients who had major depression, and you give them any one of these antidepressants and you take sort of the average of the antidepressants. 5 of them are not going to get better, and 5 of them are going to get better. That's sort of the natural history of this
50%
disease.
recovery.
50% will recover. Of the 50% who recovered, 40% will recover because of the placebo effect, and 10% will recover because of the drug. And so what you're buying in a cohort of 10 depressed patients is you are achieving one cure, meaning that the number needed to treat is 10 for on average for these drugs, which again is quite different from the popular conception about their efficacy.
Yeah. I think that gets a little bit lost. The other thing I wanted to say was, the headlines sell this as a very massive study, and it is massive in the sense that it's got about 115,000 patients. But when you start thinking about 21 different comparisons and the amount of data that's feeding into each one of those comparisons, the numbers get a fair bit smaller. And the average size of these trials, they said, was about 224 patients, which is not a very large study. And if there is publication bias or there are studies that are missing, small studies may actually be exaggerating the size of these effects, which is something that's a little bit concerning. I am totally impressed by the fact that they were able to dig up all this additional data, but I am a little bit concerned that the evidence starts to look more impressive than it is, just based on the size of those different studies themselves. I don't know. Yeah,
I don't know if you guys picked this up when they were describing the distribution of the drugs that were studied. And I calculated that here because I was impressed by it. 117 of the 522 were for fluoxetine, i.e. Prozac. 114 were for paroxetine, i.e. Paxil, and 96 were for amitriptyline. So those three drugs accounted for 53% of all of the studies that were in this meta-analysis. And the remaining 30%, 37% was everything else. Yeah. So this meta-analysis is incredibly skewed towards actually three drugs.
Yeah, and so it's something we certainly want to take into account. The last point I wanted to make was it surprised me that there were so many placebo-controlled trials done here, because antidepressants have been around for a long time and presumably have been demonstrated to be effective given that they are on the market. Why they were able to do so many different trials in which they compared to placebo as opposed to compared to an active comparison was unclear to me. I don't know, Ludovic, if you had any insight on that one.
Yeah, it's been described multiple times. So the overall network includes older trials. Mm-hmm. They went back to 1979. And one explanation is that there are not many incentives to run head-to-head trials comparing active drugs against each other. For instance, the approval by the regulatory agencies requires submission of placebo-controlled trials. That might explain.
For a new drug, when there is already an effective treatment, they would still require placebo-controlled trials?
That's the rule.
How would you get that past an ethics board? Let's say I want to develop a new antibiotic. I couldn't compare that to placebo for treatment of pneumonia.
Maybe because there's no best alternative therapy. There are a lot of alternative therapies.
So you're saying this is the case for antidepressants, but not across the board. I see. Okay.
Provided you have remaining uncertainty.
I see. Okay. Any other issues people want to raise before we?
Yeah, I thought it would be interesting maybe to hear, Ludovic, you describe a little bit about how the assessment of bias for the studies that were included in this meta-analysis is done, just in sort of very lay terms.
Right. I would focus on 2 points. The first one I mentioned in the introduction, it's that the major assumption in this analysis is that the evidence coming from head-to-head trials, the direct information, needs to agree with the indirect information coming from trials with comparing drugs to other comparators. So that's the first assumption you want to verify. That's what the authors did. And overall, they found that about 9% of the 93 comparisons, 9% showed statistically significant evidence of inconsistency, meaning that the head-to-head trials give effect sizes that are not compatible with effect sizes coming from indirect evidence. That's for the primary outcome.
So what does that mean?
Wait, can I weigh in on this? Because it seems to me there's no necessary reason for this consistency to exist, because the placebo effect could vary. The baseline could vary. In other words, in some populations, you may be very susceptible to the placebo effect, and 50% of your population gets better. In other 10%, and therefore the relative comparison is going to be very different depending on what that comparison looks like in your particular population.
You're right, Matt. One explanation to the inconsistency.
Noted.
One explanation is that we think of the placebo as a common comparator, but it's really not.
Yeah,
It's complicated.
Another explanation could be that there is bias. You have bias either in the placebo-controlled trials or you have bias in the head-to-head trials. One peculiar aspect in that network is the vast majority of head-to-head trials were funded, promoted by the industry, and meaning that the pharmaceutical companies have complete control on the design, conduct, and reporting of these trials.
Yep. So that was 78%, I think, of all trials. And I'm not sure what it was of the head-to-head, but 78% of all these trials were drug company trials. And certainly that could play a role.
So Ludovic, of those 9% that they identified where there were inconsistent findings between direct and indirect in the head-to-head, did they exclude those data or did they simply control for that heterogeneity?
That's an excellent question.
Well done, Don. We need to bring Ludovic back because he gives us positive feedback. All right.
So the authors here decided to report the findings combining the direct and indirect evidence across the whole network.
Inclusive.
So the primary analysis that is reported and that is the basis of the conclusion does not address this inconsistency.
Interesting.
So I agree with you. It raises this question. When facing this inconsistency, should you go for the weighted average, combining the two sources of information, or should you try to tear things apart and identify the best source of information? Meaning, would you look rather at the head-to-head trials or maybe the placebo-controlled trials or an indirect source of information?
What's the answer?
I think it should be documented by the second part, which is an assessment of the risk of bias in individual studies.
Yep.
And I'm not sure you want to combine apples and oranges.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so we need to move on to our second segment. So let me get your last takes. What do people think? Overall, you impressed with this study, or what's your final thought?
I'm impressed with the study.
Yeah, me too.
I'm unimpressed with antidepressants. I find the data on the antidepressants decidedly depressing.
Unfortunately, I share that, Don.
Yeah, I'm impressed with the study and the rigor that they approached it. But I guess I'm more impressed with the placebo effect. And
it is amazing. It really is.
The question really is, should we pull the blanket off the placebo effect? Because the placebo effect apparently has some function in society.
Agreed. I think we want to be very clear what we're talking about here. That we're not talking about all depression or all conditions here. We're really talking about just what this meta-analysis focused on. So that
absolutely.
Obviously these are severe conditions for which the drugs do well. I haven't reviewed the evidence on other conditions, but fair enough. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ludovic, for joining us for this segment. And
Thank you for having me.
Well, hopefully we'll have you back again sometime.
Yeah.
Cool.
Love to.
Cheers.
Okay, so now for our second segment, we are going to take advantage of the fact that we have actually here at Boston University a resident expert on meta-analysis.
Another expert
on meta-analysis. Mike LaValley. Mike, do you want to say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor of biostatistics here at Boston University, and I've been here for a long time.
Couple of years.
It that way. Yeah.
Couple of years.
Yeah.
It's awesome. We published a paper together.
Yes, I published a paper with Chris.
It was great.
And me.
And you.
Well, you and I not together, but Mike and I have.
This is a network meta-analysis right here.
Well,
I published with him, he's published with you, so we published together.
I feel left out.
Yes. Sorry, Don.
Isn't that how it works?
I also should say Mike teaches several courses here at Boston University that are excellent courses. I have taken two of them, one of which was a meta-analysis course. So a great opportunity. And so we thought we would take this time to basically just grill you on meta-analysis questions that we have so that in the future when we do reviews of meta-analysis, we can stop sounding like total fools. So can you just sort of start us off by talking about one of the things that we focus on is when we're reviewing papers, what are the key things that we're looking for to decide whether or not something is high quality or low quality, recognizing there's a continuum. When you're reviewing a meta-analysis, what are the things that we should be looking out for to determine whether something's a good meta-analysis or a bad one?
Well, I think one of the things you want to look at first is the comprehensiveness of the literature that's put together for this. It's sometimes difficult to judge if it's an area you're not that familiar with, but you should really try to make sure that the authors have put their time in terms of getting together a really good and robust cross-section of the articles on this particular topic. And in the paper you guys were just discussing, the network meta-analysis, it was pretty clear that they had done that, and more. They had really gone out of their way to get unpublished data and really, sort of beat the bushes to find whatever they could get. And that's sort of the level of rigor you want to see in a search for literature in any meta-analysis or systematic review.
And so are you actually going, because it's the part where I tune out completely, do you actually look at the search terms themselves and see whether or not you think they've gotten it right?
Well, I try to, but again, if it's sort of outside an area where I have some scientific background, it's hard to know. There are synonyms for particular key terms that if you work in the area, you would know of. And so you sort of do have to depend on whoever's reviewing the paper to be a subject matter expert and to look for that sort of thing. And also if you're knowledgeable in the literature, you would know if they miss a particular key study. And you want to make sure that those key studies are either in the meta-analysis or they have a good reason why it's not there. They've got their inclusion criteria set up in a way that would, knock this study out for whatever reason.
And so you've got a body of studies that you pulled together for a particular topic. Then the authors are then going to go through and try and decide, extract the information and put it together. What should I be looking for there in terms of the quality of the actual extraction and analysis?
Well, here I would try to look for have they done double extraction? So it's always a good sign if the study team has put together has had two people independently extract the data from the studies, and then the two people can sit down and compare notes, and if there's things that don't agree, can go back to the original papers and figure out why. And I mean, it sounds like it should be dead simple to do this, to take a paper that's published in the scientific literature and pull out these few key features that you need to use for meta-analysis. But actually, it can really be a bit of a nightmare. Different papers report things different ways, and it's, as systematic as we've become over the years, it's still often the case. You're searching through and trying to make sure you've got the right odds ratio, the right difference. It can actually be more complicated than it sounds.
And so when you're talking about extracting information, you're not concerned. Your main concern, although I presume it's some, isn't that they've sort of just miscoded the data, typed it wrong, that they've actually come to different conclusions about what the study is actually reporting. Right.
And it's easy to do. If somebody pulls a number off a table, somebody else gets a number out of the text, somebody finds something in a figure, and they, you'd hope it's all consistent, but, maybe this is a slightly different population they're describing in the figure or something. So it's having two people do it is actually a good idea.
It's good QC.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. And so most meta-analyses then, at least the ones that we've been reviewing, have some sort of, as Don was talking about, assessment of bias. Can you talk a little bit about how that actually works and whether we can I just trust that if it says a study is rated as, low risk of bias, that's a good study?
Well, wait a minute. The study we just did, there were none of the.
Yeah, we didn't really get into that, but
none of the studies were rated as low bias.
Almost none of the studies were rated as low bias.
They were like 80% or something were rated as moderate to high risk of bias, in fact.
Well, there's different ways to look for bias. And one way is the sort of looking for internal bias in terms of how the study was conducted. And that's the risk of bias tool. For clinical trials, Cochrane has a risk of bias assessment tool that is, I believe, what they used in that network meta-analysis. And that's pretty well documented. I think it gets a little mushier if you're trying to combine observational studies. There are a couple couple scales out there, but especially if you're looking at, say, unrandomized treatment studies that might come out of, say, administrative data, it's not always clear what the right things to look at are in terms of quality of the study. And in the network meta-analysis you were looking at, I don't know what the issues were, but it could be, for instance, things like blinding or allocation concealment, especially in some of the earlier studies, probably would be.
Yeah, I don't remember the specifics because again, you had to go through the 256-page appendix to go and read every
Which you did.
Which I did, and I remember. And the thing is, I remember actually there's one reason that so many of the studies come up, and I'm gonna have to dig it up because it's actually, I think it's kind of important. And so, I mean, so you didn't answer the last question, which is can I just take these assessments as at face value, or are these subjective? I mean,
these are subjective. I think it's as much as we try to build in criteria that are rigorous for quality assessment of studies. This is an area that's always been criticized as being subjective. I mean, if you go back to I think it was in the 90s, Sander Greenland had a paper saying, quality scoring is inherently subjective and nobody should ever do it. And that's the title, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he wasn't mincing any words.
No,
it was,
somebody should look that up.
But so yeah, I think this is often controversial. And having worked on studies myself, which have in later systematic reviews been rated as having less than ideal quality, can be a tender point.
Can I ask a follow-up question? We've mentioned a couple of times in these podcasts about publication bias, and I vaguely understand that there is a plot called a funnel plot, which if you do that, you're to a certain extent systematically looking at those articles that are included in the meta-analysis, and it gives you some information about whether there is publication bias as part of this collection of studies.
Right.
Can you explain a little bit how that works?
Yeah, sure. And this is a little different than the type of bias we were just discussing, which would be sort of internal in the study methods. This is looking across the different studies. And for a funnel plot, what you do is you take some measure of the precision of the study results. It could be the standard error. Sometimes people use the number of subjects in the study. But if you put the really precise studies with the really small standard errors up at the top, and then you run the smaller studies with the greater standard errors down toward the bottom, you should see a funnel shape. The idea being that there's more scatter as you get less and less precision, but as long as there's nothing fundamentally different, then the center shouldn't shift. That the center will stay the same as you move down and the precision increases and it just widens out.
So could you, if you see a greater effect size in that plot amongst the smaller studies, is that what suggests that there is that you're missing some of the
Yeah, and this is often called a small study effect. That's sort of the terminology that more modern meta-analysis has sort of moved towards, is that there's a small study effect. So the small studies are giving you, usually it's a more impressive result than the larger studies do. And
which is kind of counterintuitive. That if it's a consistent effect, we should see it in a more pronounced way with a larger study, right?
Well, we should see it in a more precise way with a larger study. The confidence interval should shrink in.
But the effect size shouldn't really change.
But if the non-significant results are less likely to get published.
Right. I mean, that's sort of the issue is that, we're concerned that the publication process itself is going to make the small studies that don't reach a statistically significant result unavailable or very delayed in terms of publication.
So I just want to weigh in here because I went and looked it up. The reason that most of the studies that were found to be a high risk of bias in the network meta-analysis was attrition. It was not being able to follow up all the patients.
Yeah, I think, didn't they mention this concept of last observation carried forward?
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit about what that is? I thought that seemed really wonky to me.
It is sort of a method that was widely used that is no longer in fashion. Let me put it that way.
I'm glad to do that.
Did I offend you,
No,
Chris?
no. I have a tendency to go retro.
Oh, okay. But
So my ears pricked up when you said that.
Okay.
I'm about to go into shop for some flare pant jeans as well, with monogrammed flowers on the
Get something
thighs.
with wide collars and a wide tie.
Yeah, exactly.
Butterfly.
Velour
Butterfly.
suit.
In polyester.
Yeah, of course. Cool. And a wig.
So where were we at the beginning of this?
No idea. Not a clue.
See what we
We were
have
talking about
Meta-analysis.
last observation carried forward
Oh,
and
thank you.
imputation for
Thank
when
you.
you have no
Out of
data.
fashion.
How do you make up the data
Right.
when you have no data?
Right. So often in a clinical trial, we'll sort of bring people in repeatedly to assess the outcome. And what they've done in the past is if somebody leaves the study early, before they can get their final outcome assessment, they will use the most recent available value and just carry it forward is the terminology. They just take this exact same value and say, okay, it probably didn't change for this person.
Is this before they invented censoring?
This was before they invented many things, but yeah. So these days we would do something much more like what would be called a multiple imputation analysis, where we would sort of fill in that missing data point, but we would do it repeatedly and with some random error built into it, so that it wouldn't make the standard deviation of that last point be so weird, because if you just take fixed values and pull them forward directly, you sort of cut down on the variability a lot.
Yeah.
And so we have to account for that in a better way.
It just seems wrong.
Yeah.
You've always been anti last observation carried forward since the moment you heard about
I have.
in this recent
I have had a
meta-analysis you
turn
read.
in my pocket for last observation carried forward.
There's a phrase.
I have one more question.
Okay, go ahead.
Mike, can you explain the difference? Because I know that I suffered from this kind of misconception, and I imagine others may have. Explain really the methodological differences between a meta-analysis, as we've been talking about, and an individual patient meta-analysis.
Right. In a typical meta-analysis, we use the summary results that are published. So
You're pulling them off the table or
right.
off the figure.
Right. We're going into the published paper and we're pulling values out of that. In an individual patient data meta-analysis, and this usually happens if you've got some kind of collaborative group, you get the actual individual patient data.
So the original authors send you a data set.
Yeah, with all the patient data in it. And they presumably do things to de-identify it.
Right.
But they would send you the actual data that they used. And there are some real advantages to doing a meta-analysis with the original data that way, because you can make the outcome be exactly the same from study to study. You can you can sort of unify lots of things that, if somebody did a good imputation analysis, somebody else did last observation carried forward, you can go in there and redo the last observation carried forward. And so it gives you an ability to sort of correct for any of these analytic issues that may show
So it's
up.
potentially more rigorous.
Yeah. And it also, one of the things we often try to do in a meta-analysis, if we get inconsistent results, this comes under the heading of heterogeneity, where we have a lot of excess variation in the study outcomes. We might want to go in there and look for factors that are linked to that variability. So we might do a regression style analysis. Now, if you have the individual patient data, that regression style analysis is much more powerful because, we can adjust for the mean age in a study, or we can actually get into the patient level and adjust for that patient's age. And that's a much better way to go. Because, if you look at clinical trials, the mean ages are not going to vary that much, for a particular medication. But within a study, that age range can be quite broad.
Do you think that the scientific community is moving in that direction with the increasing requirement by funders like the Gates Foundation and like the NIH that you eventually post your data set and make it publicly accessible so that those individual patient meta-analyses will become easier and more accessible to sort of the average researcher?
I think so, but there is an issue with some of the studies that are done, especially RCTs, which are company funded, because there's no such mechanism that requires them necessarily to make their data publicly available. Not to say some companies don't do it, but I don't think there's the same kind of enforcement mechanism.
And there's not the same kind of incentive either.
Yeah, exactly.
If I could jump in here, because
can.
this is a great segue back to that paper that you mentioned, the John Ioannidis paper in Philosophy, Ethics, and Humanities, 2008, where he talks about this, he basically provides this great example of publication bias. This was also on antidepressants. And in that study, which was his essays basically describing a meta-analysis published by Turner et al. In the New England Journal of Medicine that year. And so in that analysis, they had looked at essentially what was a complete dossier of clinical trials. That is to say, they went to the FDA and they were able to access all of the studies that had been done, irrespective of whether they were eventually published. So it was all the information that was available. And then they could compare the effect sizes that came out of those the analysis, which was as the FDA saw it, versus the analysis that was based on the published data. And the results were quite different. So on average, the FDA dossier suggested that the standardized effect sizes for antidepressants was around 0.3. And for the as-published meta-analysis, it was around 0.6, roughly double.
Higher?
Much higher, much more efficacious. And so then when you drilled down and you looked at the fate of the studies, there were 74 studies in the FDA dossier here, of which 26 remained unpublished and 48 were actually published. Now, when you look at what was the direction of publication bias based on the outcomes of the study, this is where it gets really kind of a little bit, eyebrows go up sharply. Well,
I'm just trying to see where the question is.
Well, we're going to ask him to comment. So we had 38 of these 74 studies reported a positive effect of the antidepressants.
I was told there would be no math.
Of those 38 positive studies, 37 of them got published and one was unpublished.
Okay.
So almost all of them.
Yep.
Of the 36 out of 74 that were negative or equivocal, 22 never got published at all. 11 were published, but were spun in the editorial to suggest that they actually were positive studies, even though they weren't, according to the FDA dossier. And of the remaining 3, only 3 actually, I think is only one out of the 3 actually got published. Yeah. So it was really.
So you think they have ulterior motives?
Absolutely. So in other words, this issue of publication bias is not. It's not
benign.
It's not a little thing. It's a huge thing.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, in that Turner study, if you look through that paper, it is eye-opening because they actually have a table. Well, sort of, it's more of a graph, I guess, but they break the studies out by how the FDA viewed them. Were they positive studies, and meaning that they led credence to making this drug available, or were they ambiguous, or were they negative? And they color coded the studies by drug and showed you which were published, which were not published, and it was pretty striking.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we got to end it there. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
This was great. Appreciate it.
Super cool. You should come back.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So finally, in our last segment, which is our Amazing and Amusing segment, we want to highlight some of the things that make us enjoy our jobs even more than we already do. Look at the weird and wacky stuff that goes on in our field, or stuff that is just inspiring to Chris, or is, I'm not even going to categorize the things that Chris likes to talk about. So, Chris, why don't we just start with you? Sorry, Don. I know I told you I was going to start with you, but I like to change it up.
Okay, Don.
Okay, Chris.
Are you all right with that?
Yeah.
All right.
You've already spent 28 of your 30 minutes, haven't you?
Oh, well, I'll have to speak extremely fast.
I'm hitting the timer. Start now.
All right, go. So this was a study that I twigged to after seeing it highlighted in the New York Times. It was a social science study by the lead author Vossoughi, Vosoughi, and colleagues, published in Science 2018. And they were really interested in this issue of how information disseminates through the Twitterverse. And whether there's a differential effect of true rumors versus false rumors, and how well they do in the, this is all sort of in the context of the recent presidential elections,
very topical.
The Russians spinning the election and stuff.
If it's true, is it a rumor?
So they called all of these things rumors, but they later categorized them into false and true rumors, as opposed to fake news, which has become a more political term. And so they start with the premise that truth is essential for making decisions about practically anything. So this is an important issue, right?
It's not how we mostly make
economic decisions or decide who to go to war with or where to spend our money. We'd like to have some actual facts rather than rumors. Okay. So they said that while truth is very important, that falsehoods are A, widespread, especially in social networks, are B, very difficult to spot, and C, are capable of causing immense harm, as we have seen. And this problem has gotten worse in the setting of social media, and particularly Twitter, where it's very difficult to know where these messages originate. And so what they did is they analyzed Twitter cascades, meaning there was a message sent out and then rippled through the Twitterverse with multiple retweets.
Twitter sphere.
And so they wanted to see that into the Twitter sphere. They wanted to see, like, if you tweet a message, how many subsequent users will retweet that message, and how will it branch, and overall how many total tweets will generate off of that one message.
The answer to when I tweet things out is 0.
Well, that's my experience too. I'm like incredulous. For me, Twitter doesn't work at all.
The number of times I've thought I've tweeted out something really funny.
Leslie, you must have a different experience.
Nobody tweets it. Yeah.
That's right. No, none of my jokes get retweeted.
Yeah.
And I have a really good one, but I'll tell you later.
You might question why.
So they did this analysis using basically big data that they'd harvested off of Twitter, and using all sorts of fancy programs to sort of automatically triage rumors into true or false rumors, because there were a lot of them. They started with 126,000 rumors.
Yep.
And some of them were false and some of them were true. And what they found, which was really interesting, was that that there is surprisingly, a far larger number of true rumors that are initiated. And so the spread of false rumors is not because there are more false rumors started. It is because people do not generally enjoy reading true rumors. They find them boring.
Yeah.
Right? By contrast, so like, the number of true rumors was like range from being 1,000 to 10,000, whereas the number of false rumors was generally less than 1,000. So it's a comparative minority, but the impact of the false rumors was vast. Far more penetration than the true rumors. And so the ripple effect of the false rumors vastly exceeded the true rumors by a log order. It was really kind of a profound and very cynical revelation about our thirst as a society for believing things that are striking and kind of extreme and novel.
Is this not thematically linked to the comments that we've made a million times about the headlines that get picked up on these studies? That what the media is interested in are the things that it doesn't matter, the things that are most likely to not be true, the things that are novel and crazy, and we just want to be true.
Sensationalism.
Exactly. I'm glad you made that point, because that's why
welcome.
I selected this paper.
Bring it home, Matt.
It's exactly the same thing that, this is where the asparagus causes cancer studies become so popular in the public meme. It's because who would have thought something so crazy could be true? Wow.
So
I got to go tell everybody.
Can I just say that that's not true?
It might be true. I don't know.
I don't know.
I love asparagus.
I'm not such a big fan.
So that's a false rumor. That's not a
false
true rumor.
I don't think there's
That's
such thing
a
as
false
a
rumor.
true rumor.
Is an oxymoron, isn't it?
All right. Well, that's a good one. I like
thought
that,
it was
Chris.
a great study. So I encourage people to read the original paper. It's really interesting.
Okay, so I'm gonna take the
Chair's prerogative
and go second, because mine follows on perfectly from that, which is mine is actually a course syllabus. It's a course syllabus by two guys from the University of Washington named Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West, Jevin, Jevin West. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. And these guys they actually got a lot of press for this course that they put together. At first, I have to say, I thought maybe this was one of those things that people put together as a syllabus and just put it out there as a joke. I'm very prone to believing these things, so I assumed that it probably was. But it turns out this is an actual course. You can go online and watch. They've made all their lectures public. The title
So it's a Moog?
No, I don't. Well, I think it's just a YouTube thing.
Okay.
The title of the course is Calling BS in the Age of Big Data. And this is a course. So let me just read you the synopsis. Our world is saturated with BS. Learn to detect it and diffuse it. The course will be offered as a 1-credit seminar, blah, 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 blah.
Do they actually say that?
What?
Blah, 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 blah?
No.
Because that would go along with the BS theme.
They don't actually say BS
The
either.
they don't. Learning objectives are remain vigilant for BS contaminating your information diet, recognize said BS whenever and wherever you encounter it, figure out for yourself precisely why a particular bit of BS is BS, provide a statistician or fellow scientist with a technical explanation of why a claim is BS, and provide your crystals and homeopathy aunt with an accessible and persuasive explanation of why a claim is BS.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And you can go online and you can watch all their lectures.
I want to get a master's in that.
It's really well done.
Wow. So putting our two studies together, it means that consumption of BS leads to verberia.
Oh, are we editing? Is that staying in?
All right, Don, what do you got?
So, Chris, when you're listening to this podcast, you're going to start laughing before you get to the
absolutely.
punchline, like you always do.
Yeah, what I've noticed is that my laughs gather in intensity and duration when I have daughters in the car.
So, Don, what do you got for us?
All right. So I didn't realize this, but apparently the propensity of masshole drivers to drive to the very end of a open
Merge.
merge.
I do it all the time.
Right.
Meaning you wait till the last minute.
No, you go to the front of the line, and
Yeah.
rather than
then
merging
you merge.
early, you merge late,
Yeah.
and it's considered
you wait until
considered to be a very hostile thing to do.
Okay, wait a minute. We have this fight in my house all the time, and I think I know what the answer is. Go ahead.
So apparently, the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts has been trying to get people to actually do that, despite the
Merge
fact
late.
that we all get really pissed off when somebody goes past us and goes to the front of the line and then merges. And apparently it's called a zipper merge.
Absolutely.
And it is 35% more efficient in moving people from point A to point B when there's a traffic jam like that and there's an open lane.
Yes.
So this is justification for massholes to continue to doing what they are pilloried for all over the state.
So two things. So yes, this is you should use all available space.
Yes.
And you should merge as late as possible. And it's not efficient necessarily for the person who's in the traffic. It's efficient for moving cars behind you.
Right, forward. Because they're blocking the lanes behind them and
Exactly.
plugging up the highway.
Yes.
But
and
it
so
still pisses me off.
as soon as I learned of this, I now do this. I feel really bad about it, but I am that guy who cuts in.
Are you really?
I am, because it's good for traffic.
I'm with Matt. I do
and
it too.
that's what I tell myself. Second of all, I believe it was you who told me. We should point out here that Don is a New Yorker, so he's taking every opportunity to point out
massholes.
point out that New York drivers are only the second worst drivers in the
No,
United
New York
States.
drivers are great.
Oh,
All the
wow.
roads are perpendicular or parallel,
It's not
as
the
opposed
roads,
to Massachusetts.
Meaning that there's no challenge.
none
so they look good.
whatsoever.
meaning that there's very little conflict.
But I believe it was you who told me that when you moved here, you learned that there is no potential space between two cars that you
Into
cannot
which
merge
I
into.
cannot merge.
Yes,
That's true.
Which
That was a
agree.
skill I learned in
I
Massachusetts.
agree 100%.
Yeah.
You learn
All
fast.
Well,
You're now a prodigal son.
Well, that's the end of our program. If you got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at @PopHealthyX, or you can tweet me at @ProfMattFox, or Chris at @ID.Gill, or Don at @DThea1. Or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Director of Lifelong Learning at BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler, who is going to be awake for hours editing this one. Thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you download the next episode.